Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to 2214 Data Structure course. In this session, well, actually in the next two videos, we're going to quickly discuss the hashing and hash map. Okay, if you look at the Zybook, it is a relatively small component. It has only 7 or 8 nodes. In the whole chapter. So this is actually a relatively light module, and I would recommend you to go through the materials quickly and accomplish the labs or the exercise quickly, because the next module, especially if the module is graph or the algorithm, usually it is more challenging. So I would rather you save more time for other tasks. So let's go to the real topic. Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about the hashing. So what is hash? So basically hash, you can imagine it as a way to group the data or the entry or record. Say group. Ooh, it's not a good day. So like we said, hashing is to group data based on their properties and distribute them into different, in our book, we call it a bucket. So basically, it's type of a grouping mechanism, okay? And obviously, we should group data based on some features. Okay, sorry guys, for whatever reason my input device does not work as it planned, so we open another notepad. If I want to write something, I will just type it here, and if I need to draw, I just draw on the paint board, okay? So the hashing is basically group data based on features, and here the data could be record, you could have some student record, you could have numbers, you could have files, so whatever you want to do, okay? And the feature, what type of feature are we talking about? In the Zybook and in the Realize It, they call it the key. So basically, this is some type of property that should be unique for each entry or each record. So this is very important, because if you have multiple entries have the same key, then that would be very tricky, because that's like we have two students with the same student ID, or if we have two persons with the same social security number, that would be extremely hard, okay? And in the book, and frequently they use the modular operator to represent the way to group. For example, modular 10 or modular 100, this basically means to calculate the remainder if you divide a number by 10 or divide a number by 100, and what is the remaining, what is the leftover part. And based on this, you can distribute the data entries into different groups. And here we have one example, okay? So you can see we actually have 4 buckets. Let's say we have bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket bucket 3, and a bucket 4. Okay, let's say bucket 3. And of course, you want to distribute the record into different buckets based on the key. For example, if we have the student ID, and we can say, hey, we are going to distribute you into different buckets based on your ID number modular 4. Okay, And we know that when you have a integer modulo 4, you will always have the remainder is somewhere between 0 to 3. Okay, it's either you modulo 4, you will get a modulo result 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. And you can actually map to different bucket. Okay, and there are several things when we have a hash function or when we have this hash type of data. We expect some properties. One property which is evenly distributed. We want it to be evenly distributed. Why? So let's say we have 1,000 entries. If we have 1,000 record, okay, and we are going through some type of hash function and distribute them into the 4 bucket. If bucket 1 got 900 of the data entry, you are killing me. If bucket 1 get 900 entry, bucket 2 get 25, bucket 3 get 50, and bucket 4 get 25. This is a very skewed distribution, so the bucket 1 will be heavily, so basically you're going to have a distribution look like this. This is rocket high, and the remaining 3 columns are very low. Okay, so in this way, when we try to search for some item, we said, hey, whether or not this item exists in your hash table, we hash it, and we find that if it exists, if an entry exists, so we try to see whether or not this entry is in our system already, and we find out that if an entry exists, based on the key, it will be in bucket 1. So then what do? We need to go to bucket 1 and see, oh, there are 900 entries. And how can I figure out whether or not a specific entry is in it? I just need to go through this 900 entries one by one. So it will be, you will go back and get some performance very similar to the linear search efficiency, which we try to avoid when we use the hash. Okay. And in the Zybook, there are 2 things we actually introduce to handle this collision. Okay, if you have 2 entries or multiple entries hashing to the same bucket, they have different ways of handling such collision. One is chaining. I think this figure illustrates the scenario very well. Okay, see, you can have multiple entries falling into the same bucket. And if they force into the same bucket, you just use a linked list to chain them together. And in this way, if you try to search some entry whether or not it exists, you will use the key to determine if it exists, which bucket it will force into, and then you just search the linked list associated with this bucket. So you can see if this is a linked list, there are several good things. One is scalable. Okay, it's scalable because you can make this linked list as long as you want, and it could be very skilled. Like we mentioned in the previous example, you may have 900 entries in this linked list, and the remaining are all empty. So it go back to something like a linear search, but that is not the shortcoming of this linked list. That is the shortcoming of your poor hash function design. So basically you design a hash function that actually does not capture the property of the data, and they will not evenly distributed into the system. They will focus on one bucket. Okay. So we want this thing to be scalable, and at the same time, one important feature of all hash functions, no matter you are using chaining or we are going to see in the direct mapping way of handling this type of collision, is the procedure must be determined or repeatable. What does that mean? That basically means once we have a hash function, every time you give this record to the hash function, it will always project it into the same bucket. In other words, let's say we have your social security number, and we are going to do a modular operation to your social security number by 100. That basically means we're only looking at the last 2 digits of social security number, okay? And your social security number is a fixed number, so the last 2 digits will also be fixed. So in this way, we know at any time, no matter it's Tuesday or Wednesday, it's raining or sunshine, snowing, freezing cold, or very, very hot, when we use this function to map your social security number, you will always go to the bucket 98 because that's the last 2 digits of social security number. So it must be determined, or in other words, we say that it's repeatable. Okay, every time it should go to that bucket. Okay, so you can see if we're using linked list to handle this sort of collision, you have multiple entries forced into the same bucket, it could go very skewed. Okay, you can have someone with a very long linked list. On the other side, you can have something totally empty. Okay. And in the book, they also introduce another way of handling this collision, which is called linear probing. Okay, this is more like we handle the data within the array, okay, or within the data structure. So in this subset, we say we handle collision within the array. And here we have a very good example. Okay, so you can see we have a bucket from 0 to 9, and it's actually the hash function is key modular 10. So you're only looking at the last digit of this number. Okay, so 113 modular 10, you look at the last digit is actually 3, so we put it in a bucket 3. 34, we put it in bucket 4. And when we have 124, we have a 124 because bucket 4 is already filled. What do? We go down and search for the next empty slot. Okay, we go down and search for the next available slot. And in this specific example, the slot 5 is originally empty. So we just put 124 in it. So if you read or if you have gone through the exercise, you will notice that, okay, now we have a very bad situation because now if we try to insert 75 into the list, because 75 modular 10 belongs to bucket 5 and the bucket 5 is filled. So what are we going to do? We're going to go down and search for the next free bucket. And in this case, you will put 75 in bucket 6. Okay, so in this way, we are going to face a few problems. Okay, the first issue, if you're doing linear probing, is the scalability issue. Scalable issue, whether or not it's scalable. Okay, so you can see all the nodes will stay in the list. So basically, you need to pre-allocate the array as large as the number of entries. So basically, the array is as large as the number of active entries. Okay, you may see that. What do you mean by active entry? We're going to explain later. Okay, we're going to explain this later. Okay, so this is not really a very scalable issue because you have to predetermine that how many entries you may need to maintain. Okay, the second thing is there is no control there is no control on how far there's no control on how far is your real storage slot from your projected slot. Okay, what do we mean? Okay, imagine this. Now let's go back to the drawing part, and hopefully the machine start to calm down. So every a few weeks, this drawing board will become crazy. Okay. So let's say we have an array look like this. Okay. So you get the idea. Okay, these are, each of them is a bucket. Okay. So if I put a cross in it, that means there is a number in it already. So it's occupied, 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 so on and so forth. So everyone is occupied until the last one. The last one is free. So now let's say that I want to add a new number into this hash table, and after I use the hash function, apply the hash function to the key, I find out that it should be added here. Okay, the very first entry. Unfortunately, this is occupied. In linear probing, what do I need to do? I need to go down, go down, go down, go down. I need to go all the way down until I find a free slot, which will be here. So the number I want to add, it will end it up here. Okay, where will this be? How far will be this, the slot I really can use from my projected slot? There's no guarantee whatsoever. Okay, if we predict the size of the array correctly, we can guarantee you there will be one. There will be one, but we will not know where it's end up. So this will be, why is this bad? This is bad because when you try to search for an entry, okay, you are going to apply the hash function to the key, and you are going to look at the projected slot, and you find out that, okay, the projected slot is occupied, but it's not the number I want. Does that mean that number does not exist in this array? No. Why? Because we're using linear probing. So what do we need to do? We need to go down the list. We need to go down this array. We need to go all the way down until we find, and we will stop either when we find the entry that we want, or we find an empty slot. If we find an empty slot, it basically means, okay, if the entry you're searching for is actually into the system, it should be added here. Otherwise, it's not in the system. It's not in the system. So from this point of view, you can see that the bad thing using linear probing is it's very hard to predict what the overhead looks like or what the overhead could be, because you can end it up very deep in the array. Even though you are projected to only look at slot number 1, but you are actually go down until slot 999, and you finally figure out that, okay, it's not there. Okay, so this is one thing I don't like. And the other thing, actually, is the linear probing does not work well with highly dynamic record. What do we mean highly dynamic record? We basically means if you need to add, remove frequently, then I don't think linear probing will work well. Why? It's for the same reason we just explained. Okay, every time if you have a collision, you need to go down the list and until you find an empty slot. Every time you have a collision, you need to go down the list until you find an empty slot. And let's say later you said, oh, I want to remove this record. So you're going to remove this record. Okay, so now suddenly this slot become empty. And when I try to search for this entry I just add, the entry that I just added here. So this one I try to search, okay. and I look at its projected slot. It's not there, but the next one is occupied. I look down, still not. Look down, look down, look down. When I look until here, I cannot stop. Oh, God. I cannot stop. Why? Because there used to be some value here, but I remove it. So that's why if you look at Zybook and you look at Realize It, it has to differentiate between two scenarios. One scenario is this slot was empty from the beginning of the system. The second scenario is, okay, it is empty now, but there was some data in it. If it belongs to the second case, so as we mentioned, in the linear probing mechanism, even when you see an empty slot, if there used to be some data in it, and in your search algorithm, you cannot just stop immediately, okay? You need to keep going until either you complete the whole search procedure, you go through the whole array, or you actually find a slot that was empty from the beginning of the system, or you find the data, okay? You cannot stop until one of the following happens. It could be first option that you actually find the data. You find the data entry you're looking for, okay? And the second option is that you have not found the data you are looking for, but you find an empty slot from the beginning of the system. Why you can stop here? Because if there is an empty slot from the beginning of the system, and if the data that you are searching for was originally inserted into the system, you should see it by now. You should see it by now. Otherwise, it has been removed or it does not exist. Or the third option is you actually search the whole array. So you basically go a complete circle. You go a complete circle. You have look at every entry in this search. So that's why if you look at the algorithm, you actually need to maintain a number. You need to maintain the number of entries of slots or bucket that you have examined. You need to maintain the number of slot and bucket that you have examined. If you have searched for everyone, and then you can stop there. So you can see on the screen now you have the in the linear probing 9.4. This is the insert of linear probing algorithm, and you can see these two lines actually represent how many slots or bucket you have examined. When you start this operation, it has the value of 0, and every time you examine a bucket and you find out that you cannot do the operation, it's either you cannot insert it because it's occupied, or it's not the number you're looking for. You need to increment this value. Basically, you say, hey, this is the total list. This is the total list, and I have seen one more in this list. If I have gone through the whole list, I can stop. You can see here, as long as the bucket probed is smaller than n. So as long as you have not examined every possible slot in this machine, you can continue. Okay, so like I said, the hashing itself is kind of straightforward. You just map different data based on the key into different bucket, and there are several properties we want the hashing function to maintain. One is it's predetermined, it's repeatable. So basically every time you hash this same value, it should go to the same bucket. You cannot say, oh, sometime it goes to bucket 1 and sometime it goes to bucket 3. If it goes to bucket 3, it always goes to bucket 3. Okay, so this is the first thing. And the second property when we design a hash, we want it to be evenly distributed. We don't want one bucket fill like 95% of the data and the remaining bucket has very little entry in it. Because if you look at the good property of a hash function is theoretically you can maintain a big O1 search efficiency. The assumption is that in each bucket you will have very few entries in it. So even if you have to go through 3 or 5 entries of this bucket, the overhead is very low. On the contrary, if you have 95% of the data in the same bucket and the remaining are almost empty, it ended up as a linear search. It will go back to the overhead of ON. Okay. The third thing I do want you to pay a little bit of attention is how do we handle the collision. And in the book, they introduce 2 ways. One is the chaining, the other is linear probing. Each approach has its advantage and a disadvantage. So please pay attention. And I hope with this, we provide enough information for you on the hashing. And I will see you in the next video.